My fellow presenters will be Jason Averill from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Brian Maltby from Brentwood? Brent. And Jay Fleming from Boston Fire. Without further ado, Jason.
Thank you, Sean. Perfect. Welcome, thanks for coming today. My name is Jason Averill. I'm with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it really is part of my job at NIST and really a mission space at NIST to help and engage in the codes and standards process, ensure that there's science behind the codes and standards process. And in the Fire Research Division, obviously we get involved in the fire and building codes. And firefighters are our key stakeholder, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to come here and present today. What I hope to do is take a little bit of a historical perspective and look at how and why we changed the codes. And ultimately, I hope in less than 20 minutes to convince you that this is sort of a new opportunity that the fire service can engage in the codes and standards process, be effective in a way that I don't think has always been there in the past because of a confluence of circumstances. Those include the experience that you bring to the table, the new science that is emerging, some of which we talked about this morning, and our ability to look back in history and leverage those to improve the working environment for the firefighters. Okay, so NIST is part of the Department of Commerce. We are non-regulatory, meaning the biggest stick we can bring to a codes and standards committee is science. And we find that actually winds up being pretty effective. For those who don't know, in the United States, building codes are a states' rights issue. There is no national building code, okay? So what we do is we have what we call national model codes. We have a couple of organizations, including National Fire Protection Association, International Code Council, who come up with these national model codes. That's the starting point for our states, our counties, and our local communities. And so there are opportunities based on that to engage at the national level, at the state level, and even at the local level. And I hope we can get the fire service involved at all of those. So I'm going to spend the next couple of slides reviewing some of the really important fires that we've had in history and show how these fires have really resulted in significant changes, basically how we got to where we are in a lot of our codes. Here are just some that are related to assembly fires. So anywhere we're packing people in in the case of theaters or eating and dining, that sort of thing. Starting in 1903 with the Iroquois Theater Fire in Chicago, Illinois. In that fire, we lost 602 people out of the roughly 1,900 people who were in attendance that day. One of the key issues there was a quote-unquote fireproof curtain that wound up being a significant actor in that particular fire. Moving to Boston, we have our colleague from Boston here today. In 1942, we had the Coconut Grove Fire in Boston, Massachusetts, where we lost 492 people of the roughly 1,000 people who were present at the time of the fire. In 1977, we had the Beverly Hills Supper Club Fire in Kentucky, 165 fatalities of the 2,500 people who were there. And in 2003, more recently, in West Warwick, Rhode Island, the Station Nightclub Fire, where 100 of the roughly 300 patrons that evening watching a concert were unable to escape. Each of these have had significant impact on the codes as a result. Just looking at Coconut Grove, for example, the fire in Boston, very soon after that particular fire, there was a moment where people went back, they reviewed, and they asked themselves, what are we doing in these particular types of occupancies? We got new requirements for emergency lighting, exit signage above our exits, capacity signage so we don't overload our buildings with too many people. We observed that people want to go out the way they come in, and so we designed now 50% of our egress capacity to be at that primary entrance, recognizing what is basically a phenomenon of human behavior. We got outward swinging doors, because if we get people pushing against inward swinging doors, they can't be opened. Swinging doors on either side of the revolving doors and panic hardware. All of these were directly derivative of the Coconut Grove Fire. And just so you don't think that this is related simply to assembly fires, there's a number of business fires as well. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist caught on fire, and 146 primarily young women who were working in what amounted to a sweatshop perished of the roughly 500 people who were present that day. And in 2001, we had the World Trade Center attacks in New York City. If we look at what happened directly after the fire in New York, in 1911, very soon, they began to make dramatic changes, not just to the fire rules, but to labor laws as well. So the Division of Fire Prevention was established within the FDNY. And New York State enacted 36 new labor laws, which were some of the first in the country, and began setting things like egress width requirements, proportional to the number of occupants who might be using that egress component. And in 2012, so far, we've documented roughly 40 building code changes that are directly traceable back to some of the findings that came from the World Trade Center investigation. Things like, for example, fire service access elevators in high-rise buildings. That code requirement comes out of work that was done at an ASME task group. It was NIST, the IAFF, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, IFC, a whole bunch of agencies all came together and said, we've got to take advantage of this capacity to get firefighters up to where the fires are in a timely manner, in a manner that they don't expend all their energy in the stairwells. And that ultimately was successful. It's now in the building codes as a requirement for new high-rise construction. But all of this emphasis on basically changes that are derived from lessons learned, I think was well summed up by Professor Dennis Milletti, who was talking about this, what we call design by disaster culture. And so what we do with risk management is a knee-jerk response to what's on television and on the front pages of the newspaper. It's not based on reason, it's not based on science, and it's not based on knowledge, it's political. And I think historically that's been fairly true. But I think that is definitely changing. Okay? I think there's definitely new opportunities, there's new science, and I think there's new expectations in the building codes and standards community for what it takes to get a code change put in place. One last thing I'd like to point out, and that's the residential problem. I didn't talk about landmark residential fires because basically there are none. Residential fires happen and people die in 1s and 2s and 3s. Every once in a while you'll get a family to die in a single family residential. But it doesn't have that same kind of power that we get these large, high profile, media-driven type events. But we know that residential fires are really important. If we look at the work here that was done in the Dunes experiments, that we're looking at smoke detector sighting, this particular case, we took the picture on the left. This was a manufactured home. This was the family room of that manufactured home. And the picture on the right where you've got a thick, black, heavy smoke layer dropping down to about the point where you're egressing, fully involved couch in 90 seconds. Okay? So we know we know residential fires are a problem. And we also know that from the statistics. About 88%, according to the National Fire Protection Association, of our fatalities in this country are in residences, of the 3,240 civilian fire deaths that we have. There's lots of reasons for that. They're listed here, but we all know and understand them. There's typically one way out of these. By and large, they're not sprinklered. And there's an incentive not to regulate in the home because of this kind of philosophy of my home is my castle. This was alluded to a little bit, this graph right here by Dan in the talk this morning. But we also know that the residential fire ground is where firefighters are injured. Okay? They track very well with the incidence of fire. In fact, what you're looking there are two curves. You have a curve that's downward sloping in the blue, and what that is the number of firefighter injuries. So that's good. We see injuries declining. But as Dan pointed out, the red line is the one that is somewhat concerning because as you can see, at least from 1981 through 2011, over a 30-year period, the rate of firefighter injuries is not changing. Okay? So essentially, we're getting something on the order of 20 to 25 firefighter injuries per 100,000 fires. Okay? So the reason we're having fewer firefighter injuries is a drop in fires, not necessarily related to the likelihood of a firefighter being injured. And I think some of that can come back to residential fires, that's where we know that they're being injured, and building codes and standards in the residential environment. And this is where hopefully science can play a significant role. Science can be used to inform thresholds. We can do testing specifically to answer very critical questions within the building code or within the standards community. Here's some work that we have on two of our pieces of protective equipment for the fire service. First is the face pieces. We heard a little bit about that this morning as well as the pass devices. The pass devices failing as the temperatures that they're exposed to go up, the piezoelectric would no longer alarm, and then as the temperatures go down, they go back into service again. Sort of the worst case scenario, because after the fact, we couldn't establish whether or not the pass device worked. This was observed in testing done in a standard immersion environment for pass devices in a laboratory. So what I'd like to offer forward to you today as a take-home message as I wrap up my portion for you is that as members of the fire service, I think you all are uniquely qualified and effective when you show up to participate in codes and standards committees. Okay? People listen when the fire service comes, mostly because you all have real experience of seeing what's going on in the world out there. You can bring it, you can tell stories that are backed by those experiences, but we also have science that we can arm you with. And if we access that science, combining the experience with the science, the firefighters are some of the most credible witnesses that we have in the codes and standards process. And I would urge you to leverage that to make your work environment improved. So how do you access the science? Well, you come to conferences like this. We talked a little bit about it this morning. There's also fire.gov, which actually has a new web address now. It's nist.gov/fire. But it's basically better firefighting through science, through research. All kinds of work from a number of different places, all coming together in a sort of easy to digest format so that you have access to the science. You can talk to your local officials. You can go to your building codes and standards organizations. IAFF.org, NFPA.org/research if you want statistics. They've got all kinds of statistics to back up whatever question you're thinking of. And then Steve Kerber was talking this morning, ul.com/fire service. They have a lot of really good materials on their website as well. But also understand the moment that you have. There may be an event in your community or in your state or one that captured national attention. As we've established, those are the times to go forward and push your issues as the fire service to make change, because people listen more when there's been a recent event. It's unfortunate that we have to wait for those, but that seems to be the experience. That's the sort of human behavior aspect of it. But we only get that if we participate. And it's that experience that you bring with you when you go to testify and when you go to participate that's critical. And we saw a whole presentation this morning about how fires are moving faster than ever. Well, guess what? We heard that from you all for years before we started trying to verify that in the lab. We did that in some of our smoke detector sighting experiments. You all did that in a couple of comparison videos of legacy furniture versus new furniture. It's now an established scientific fact that furniture burns differently now than it used to. But you guys were the early detectors of that. You guys were saying that long before. We need to bridge that communication. We need to hear that from you. What's happening out there? What's changing? And how can we, as NIST and UL and some of the other science agencies, how can we use our science to back you up and then go get the changes that we need to improve your environment? One other thing that I'll mention is that we also need to collect quality data. We're here today and yesterday talking about the National Fire Operations Reporting System. It's a companion piece to the NFIR system, which all of you are familiar with. But we need data about how fire departments operate so that we can deploy best tactics and strategies and ensure that any assumptions that are being made in the building code are in fact good, sound, scientific-based assumptions. This is your workplace. So hopefully this is why you want to engage, because it will make the workplace for you, safer for your fellow firefighters, but also safer for the population that we're all protecting. We can engage at the state and local level, and when you talk, people listen. So I'd like to end with one thing that I hope will capture some of your attention. In 2006, at the International Building Code hearings, there was some discussion about what we're doing in our building codes. And somebody actually verbalized what I think a lot of other people believe. And that's, we design buildings to get people out. We don't design buildings to protect the fire service. And as long as people are allowed to continue to believe that, they're going to make decisions that are going to put you all in harm's way, don't benefit our country, and aren't sound, scientific, rational basis for building codes. We can do better than that, and we need all of you to engage and participate, because I don't believe that that prevailing opinion is how we ought to be regulating our buildings. Thanks.
Now I'd like to welcome to the podium Deputy Chief Jay Fleming from the Boston Fire Department.
Yeah, I'll use the arrows. Thank you very much, Sean. Probably for the people in this audience, I'm preaching to the choir, that's why you're here. But I wanted to follow up on a couple things that Jason said before I get into mine. One is, I used to, a long time ago in the mid-90s, I had to cut back a little bit, but I sat on a group called the UL Fire Safety Council, and it was sort of a quiet group that got together once a year at UL, and UL sort of did a dog and pony show, to be perfectly frank. It wasn't their fault, that's just what people expected from them. And myself and a couple other people started to make it a more activist group, and it was actually out of some proposals that we developed in the late 90s that we had UL, we set up meetings between UL and the IAFF, and now I think the information on the UL website is unbelievable, especially for departments that have trouble developing your own training material. So sometimes it might take 10 or 15 years for something to come to fruition, but it's not going to happen unless we make it happen. The other item I want to mention is, this is very interesting. NIST actually had research in the early 80s by Vito Bobrowskis that talked about flashover occurring in about 3 minutes. At the same time, I've found articles from the president of the IAFF at the time in 1976 that said fires are burning a lot faster than a generation earlier. The problem was in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a complete disconnect between NIST and the fire service. No one talked to each other. So that information should have been acted on a lot quicker, but on both of our sides, we didn't get involved with the scientists, and the scientists tended not to get involved with the IAF. So the outcome of that interaction now is just tremendous, and it's all throughout the Redmond Symposium. And when you may have heard the term performance-based codes, and it's becoming more and more common, and when we were the first state in Massachusetts to pass the high-rise sprinkler law, and a couple of people who tried to attack it tried to argue that it was not designed to protect firefighter safety, and they were doing computer models that would show that you don't need to sprinkle, but it depended on the assumptions, which is another point I want to make. Some people are intimidated by sitting on these technical committees because you don't feel like you're an engineer or an architect and you don't have the expertise. But I am telling you, I win tons of arguments against the scientists because I don't challenge their science, I don't challenge their math, I challenge their assumptions. And everyone in this room is equally capable of making an assumption regarding how people behave in a fire. In fact, we might be better off because we didn't learn it in a book. So I cannot tell you enough how important it is for the fire service to get involved with these codes. I'm not going to read all of these things because that would take up too much time, but Local 718 has made a couple resolutions at recent IAFF conventions that, one, we want NIOSH to look at the fire protection systems when they do an investigation. What about the smoke detectors? Did they go off too late? Did the sprinkler system, should there have been a sprinkler system? And then the second one was the IAFF is in favor of photoelectric smoke detectors. We are expanding beyond the typical concern about bunker gear and helmets and SCBA, which is very important, but the IAFF knows that you can only protect firefighters so much, and so we want more input into the buildings where we work. I'm going backwards here, sorry. Now, I'm not going to read these, but it is important for firefighters to participate in the process, and in general, we don't. The NFPA, and I'll touch upon this in a second, has a ton of committees that aren't directly related to firefighting. We don't think of them that way. The place of assembly committee under the life safety code, there's no fire people on that. Now, after the nightclub fire that was mentioned earlier in Rhode Island, Jim Shannon, it wasn't fair, he was interrogated, if anybody saw this interview, I think by 2020, and they said, where did you come up, what engineering analysis was used to justify the 300-person limit before you sprinkled nightclubs? And he couldn't answer the question. The reason he couldn't answer the question is those type of decisions made on NFPA committees are not based on engineering. They're based on whatever the committee feels is acceptable. And when you looked at the makeup of the committee, it was almost all people who represented the nightclub industry. So really, the number of 300 was what the nightclub industry felt they could live with in terms of the cost of sprinklers. That's where the number came from. It wasn't based on an engineering analysis. So in Massachusetts, we have we sit on a couple of state committees, and Paul Donga, who's a fantastic fire protection engineer in Boston, one of the first that was hired by a municipal fire department, and he said, Jay, I need you to come to this committee and this meeting. And I said, why? He said, because you keep them honest. Just one fire person in the room keeps people honest from saying really stupid things. And so I found that to be the case, actually. A lot of people aren't aware the NFPA, in an attempt to address this problem, will subsidize the attendance of fire officials to the tune of about 80%. So the IAFF will fund the participation of their members, but there's nothing to stop you from sitting on the same committee and representing your local department. And when you tell your boss that they're going to subsidize it to the tune of 80%, it makes it more likely that they'll send you that. So participating in these committees is a pain in the neck and it's time consuming, but if we all participate and we all pick one committee, and then we can make a difference. So we all have to take our turn, and I'm already on a couple, so I'm not going to sit on any more. Now, this I am going to read. This was Admiral Hiram Rickover. He was basically the founder of our nuclear fleet, and I love this quote. The typical industry-controlled code or standard is formulated by a committee, elected or appointed by a committee, technical safety, a similar group. Many of the members are drawn from the manufacturers to whom the code is applied. That is absolutely true. That works for bunker gear, and it works for smoke detectors. And even if they have only half the seats, UL and the NFPA basically require 2/3 vote to change anything. So I was asked once by the Washington Post in an interview to describe the UL process, and I said, well, basically, UL is controlled by the manufacturers to the detriment of the American consumer. And when I say that, UL does fantastic work, but I said I believe that about the United States Congress as well. It's the system that's the problem, not the individuals who sit in the committee. The manufacturer and reps on the committee, they're just representing their interest. But the system assumes that we're going to be at the other side. So like they're the defense attorney, but they assume that we're going to be the prosecuting attorney. So the current committee system, it's as if you went to trial and there was no defense attorney, or there was no prosecuting attorney. You wouldn't get a very good outcome. And so we have to participate to balance off. It's a system problem, not an individual problem. So for example, on NFPA 72, in theory, the NFPA has this classification of category, and they don't want any group to represent more than 1/3 of the committee. So it sounds good. The problem is you can bunch a whole bunch of them as industry groups, consumer groups, neutral groups, and really the industry groups dominate. In addition, I'm not even sure why some of these people are on it. The Port Authority in New York represents consumers. The Port Authority in New York doesn't have any residential property. A fire consultant is considered representing consumers. The architect of the U.S. Capitol is considered an enforcer. The U.S. Capitol doesn't have any residential property. So and then the two people who represent the fire service or enforcers, one's from a town of less than 3,000 and one's from a town of less than 30,000. So literally there's no one who represents a town more than 31,000 people on the NFPA 72 Fire Alarm Code Committee. It's a bit odd. And even if you can't, the latest mantra that I hear all the time is, oh, we have model codes, don't change it at the local level. Don't change it at the local level. Everyone's the same. Well, we're not all the same. And I always push that Massachusetts had a lot of adoptions when we'd adopt the national model code. So national model codes are great, but we would adopt them and change them. And I think we were successful because since 1998, when we really started adding stuff to the model codes, the death rate per million people in Massachusetts is dropping twice as fast as the national average, and in Boston it's dropping 3 times faster. City of 650,000 people in the last 2 years, we've gone through the entire year without any fatalities whatsoever. So I'm not going to read this to you. This is just one of the interesting things. There is no union representation on the group that represents the Mass Fire Prevention Code. Now, there's a bunch of fire chiefs, and they're great guys, but I still think that unions should push for representation on these boards at the state level, because sometimes the interest of the firefighter is different than the interest of the fire chief. Not always, usually it's the same, but then the more fire safety seats we get, the better. This is the Mass Fire Training Council. This is not really a code issue, but I did think it was interesting that there's 2 union members for 12,000 paid firefighters, and there's 2 called volunteer representatives for 3,400. I just think the unions are underrepresented on all these committees. This is the committee that writes the Mass Building Code, and there's really not a lot of fire service representation. But there is a subcommittee called the Fire Protection, Fire Prevention Board, and I don't sit on it anymore, we write the sprinkler and detection requirements, and that is heavily dominated by fire officials. And so Massachusetts was the first state basically to adopt the research from the original Indiana Dunes in the mid-70s. We were the first ones to update, we were the first ones to mandate photoelectric detectors, and it's partly because of this. The fire service tends to be more progressive than building officials. That's just the nature of the beast. Now, even within Boston, I felt so strongly about this when I was fire marshal, plus they wanted to kick us out because they wanted the room, but I actually moved the entire fire prevention division down to where the building department is. That's how much I talked to the building commissioner more than I talked to the fire commissioner. And so get involved. There's been a couple, and we increased our participation. We hired fire protection engineers. I cannot emphasize that enough. We conducted joint fire building review of all large projects. The first Home Depot in this country that had sprinklers in the racks was in Boston. They'd built 600 of them without sprinklers in the racks. And we forced them to install in-rack sprinklers, and we forced them to do it retroactively in another one. NIOSH, they tend to focus on from the time the call comes in to when the tragedy occurs, but quite often there's important things that occur before then. So, for example, in the recent Worcester case where the 3-decker collapsed, that building had been taken to court by the building department for weaknesses in the foundation. That information, and it's true in Boston today, I'm not criticizing Worcester, that information, even though it was in a city database, was not made available to the incident commander. He might have made a different decision. In Chicago, in the building where the roof came down and killed a couple firemen, that building was in the Chicago City vacant building system as having weakened structural roof. So it's not just the codes. I cannot emphasize enough how important we should increase our interaction with the local building department, because they can be our best friend. And so I just wanted to touch on those issues. I'm trying to think. I just want to make sure I hit my notes. Keeping people honest. We have to. Oh, here's one. We have solved the fire communication problem in the city of Boston. Our radios work everywhere. And when I got on the job, even to the mid-90s, they didn't work anywhere. There were whole sections of the city they didn't work. There were buildings they didn't work in. There were basements. This is before 9/11 when that became an issue. Because we worked with the building department. We changed the Mass Building Code. Remember we used to have those firefighter phones in the lobbies that no one ever used? You'd have to plug them in. Anybody still require those in this city? Anyways, I didn't like them. We never used them. When I was fire marshal, I got the state building code changed to allow alternatives that were equivalent. And then we started requiring repeaters in these high-rises. And then from there, we went to bidirectional amplifiers. So another thing is we worked with the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Every time somebody wanted to put up a high-rise, we got the right to put one of our antennas on top of their building. So between putting the antennas on the top of the building and the bidirectional amplifiers inside the building, our radios work everywhere. There's no problem at all. And that's a huge firefighter safety issue, even though it's the building code. And even buildings that weren't undergoing renovation, I wrote letters to all of them saying, just to let you know, our radios don't work in your building, and if there's a fire, there'll probably be a lot more damage and people might die. Now, how quickly do you think they contacted us to put the system in there? They have these $50 million investments. They don't want anything to happen to them. So by looking at the holistic problem, getting involved in the code process, viewing building codes as firefighter safety tools, we can make our world a lot safer for the things that we can't control.
We're going to have a question and answer period at the end, Don. Okay.
While Sean is setting that up for me, is there any Canadians in the audience?
Ooh, hey, you got friends, eh?
That means I have to tell the truth. Sorry about that. I thought maybe I could just say whatever I wanted and everybody believe it. We're moving already. So, thank you very much. My name is Brian Maltby, and I'm Division Chief of Fire Prevention for the City of Brampton, which is in Ontario, Canada. And Brampton is a city of about 550,000 people. We're located on the northwest border of the City of Toronto. And my participation today is to sort of collaborate with my colleagues that were up here earlier and give a bit of a Canadian experience to what we're doing there. And it's amazing, we never had the opportunity to get together and confer before this session, but you're going to hear a lot of things that they said before me that I'm going to say. And it's from a Canadian perspective. So to do that, we're going to take a look at some Canadian stuff, a little bit of context. We're going to talk about Canadian code and the hierarchy of the Canadian codes, building and fire code relationship, a little bit of objective-based codes. Jay talked about performance-based codes. In Canada, we call them objective-based codes. They're pretty much similar, though. I do want to spend some time on some fire safety code issues that we are specifically addressing at both the national and the provincial level. I want to talk about some positive developments that have come out of some of the code activity that we've done. Some of it is related to code and some of it not so much, but I think it sort of supports what we're saying about getting the fire service more involved with the development of safety issues. A brief conclusion, and then I think at the end we're going to have, you're coming up next, Sean, and then we're going to do a Q&A at the end. So some Canadian stuff. The Canadian Constitution Act is the supreme law in Canada and is one of the oldest working constitutions in the world. It has its genesis in the British North American Act of 1867 and the Magna Carta that was created in Great Britain in the year 1215. So that makes it almost 800 years old. The Constitution, through our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, outlines our system of government as well as the civil rights and liberties of Canadians and those in Canada. The Constitution sets out the divisions of powers, responsibilities, and duties between the federal government and between the provincial and territorial governments. And so each province or territory in turn takes these responsibilities and decides who's going to do them, whether the province or the territory is going to do them, or whether the municipal local government's going to do them. So you might ask yourself, why is that important? Well, construction industry in Canada is a $171 billion industry that employs 1.24 million people and consumes 40% of our natural resources and 50% of our energy. To remain vital, the construction industry is demanding better, safer, energy efficient, and more affordable construction materials and technology, and looks to the federal government to assist in that endeavor. To that end, the federal government, through its Ministry of Industry, has created the National Research Council of Canada. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called NRC, does a lot of research, I believe in conjunction with NIST, and also works with other organizations such as NFPA. And they oversee the development of our national model building and fire codes. Through the Constitution, the provinces and territories have the responsibility to adopt national model codes in whole or in part and create their own codes. A couple of significant differences between the code development and adoption process in Canada compared to the United States is the code development process is very tightly controlled by the federal and provincial levels of government, whereas the ICC and the NFPA codes are developed more by special interest groups, as Jay sort of pointed out a number of times, en masse, and the adoption of a code is done by the province or territory, and the local jurisdiction must adhere to that code. So in Canada, unlike many jurisdictions in the US, the province or territory has their own code, and the local jurisdiction does not have the ability to change that based on local configuration, which I think is totally wrong. So for example, in some parts of the province where I live, Ontario, the response time to get 10 firefighters on scene may be 30 or 40 minutes, but if you only require a 20-minute rated door between a corridor and a suite, that isn't sufficient enough. Whereas in a large municipality where they have a 4-minute response time, that 20-minute door may be sufficient. So the building code in Canada defines how buildings are built and what must be done when they undergo renovations. So once a building is constructed, and occupied, the fire code is the applicable law, and the enforcement of the fire code is critically important so as to maintain the fire protection systems and features that were included in the original design of the building, and many of them relate to firefighter safety. Jay talked briefly about performance-based codes. We call them objective-based codes in Canada. They've really started to take off. We introduced them about 8 or 9 years ago. They started to become more and more prominent, especially in the case of building code activity. And so in Canada, the owner has 2 ways to comply with either the building code or the fire code. The first manner is to comply with the prescriptive acceptable solutions found in the body of the code. The second method is available to the owners to get approval from the authority having jurisdiction to propose a solution that satisfies the objective, and the objective is pretty well defined for the prescriptive requirement. So what that means is, and rather than try to explain it in words, I'm going to give you an example from the Ontario Building Code that sort of, I'm hoping, sort of shows you what an objective-based code is and how an owner can comply with it. So under 3.1.8.16.1 of the Building Code Division B, it says that the maximum area of a wire glass in an exit fire separation shall not be more than a specified area as set out in a table. And for this example, let's say that that maximum area of wire glass can't be more than 2 square feet. So this is the actual objective that's related to this prescriptive requirement. It says that this code requirement is to limit the probability that as a result of the design or construction of a building, a person in the building would be exposed to an unacceptable risk of injury due to fire caused by persons being delayed or impeded from moving to a safe place during a fire emergency by retarding the effects of fire on emergency egress facilities. So what does that mean in real English? Well, what it says is that if you can mitigate the effects of the fire on that exit facility by providing some other safeguard, for example, a sprinkler system or perhaps a fire damper, then the designer can exceed that maximum area of wire glass that's set out in the table. In our example, that was 2 square feet. And so why is that important? Well, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of permutations of objectives and functional statements. None of them deal specifically with firefighter safety. Those tens of thousands of objectives and functional statements, none of them address firefighter safety. And that's wrong. At least not yet, they don't. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Lightweight construction is not new. Let me get some water here. It's been around now for over 40 years. What is new is that now we're starting to understand the effects that fire has on lightweight construction. And as much as I don't like it, lightweight construction is not going away because of the affordability of it, and because lightweight construction gives the designer the luxury of wider and longer spans and provides him with greater flexibility and creativity. The Canadian Fire Service is working to ensure that the codes address the significant shortcomings of lightweight construction by ensuring that it's either protected passively, for example, by the installation of gypsum board, or actively by the installation of fire sprinklers where they would normally not be required. There's also a move to inform firefighters more about the inherent dangers of lightweight construction, and the Canadian Fire Service is working with the Canadian Wood Council to put together some training materials. So because lightweight construction is not going away, I think the Fire Service has to rethink their approach to fighting fires in lightweight construction, and that the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation's Life Safety Initiatives is a great starting point. 6 of those 16 initiatives are very appropriate for how the fire service should think about fighting fires in lightweight construction. And those 6 are, number 1, define and advocate the need for cultural change within the fire service relating to safety, incorporating leadership, management, supervision, accountability, and personal responsibility. Number 2, wait a minute, back up here, got on too far. Number 2, enhance the personal and organizational accountability for health and safety throughout the fire service. Number 3 is a big one in my view. Focus greater attention on the integration of risk management with incident management at all levels, including strategic, tactical, and planning responsibilities. All firefighters must be empowered to stop unsafe practices. Number 11 is national standards for emergency response policies and procedures should be developed and championed. And number 15 is advocacy must be strengthened for the enforcement of codes and the installation of home fire sprinklers. Foam plastics in construction materials, or as I like to call it, solid gasoline. The proliferation of foam plastics in construction materials is a result of many green initiatives that have been introduced. The National Research Council of Canada has struck a task group to identify all the provisions of the National Building Code that relate to the use of foam plastics in building construction materials, and to review all of the installation and testing standards that are referenced in the building code to determine if those provisions and standards adequately address the fire safety concerns relating to the use of foam plastic in building constructions. This is another example, in my view, where innovation technology in the Green Initiative has been advanced, perhaps at the cost of firefighter safety. Residential fire sprinklers. Unlike the NFPA and ICCO code development process in the US, where the populace can influence what goes into the codes, the Government of Canada ensures that the various stakeholders hold great influence over how our codes are shaped. What I'm attempting to say here is that the development and home building industry have great influence in any code change proposal, and the government is moving very cautiously in this area. I believe that most people understand the value of sprinklers. It's just that the cost is scaring some of them. As such, the NRC is undergoing a cost-benefit analysis, and I believe that those results will be made public by the end of the year. My hope is that the next generation of people will be asking themselves, why was all this deliberation in the year 2000 and later about residential sprinklers, just the same way that we talked about smoke alarms 30 years ago? I always say the best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago. The second best time is today, and the same can be said about sprinklers. It was recently announced that the Home Fire Sprinkler Coalition has received a fire prevention and safety grant through FEMA to fund an ambitious new strategy to battle the age-old problem of lack of information of home fire sprinklers and the life-saving benefits of home fire sprinklers. In Ontario, which is my home province, beginning in January of 2014, most of the existing private residents for seniors, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable occupants will be required to be retrofitted with residential sprinklers. Now, I don't think that that's new for a lot of places in the US, but it is new for Canada, and it certainly is about time. Spatial separation. My dad always said, buy land. They're not making any anymore. And that's very evident with the development industry. More and more builders are building bigger houses on smaller lots for the purpose of maximizing their own investment. That, in combination with non-traditional building materials and methods, is leading to an increase in the number of fires that involve multiple buildings. It seems more and more that the fire service is finding fires through the roofs and spreading to adjacent buildings upon arrival of the first-in unit. Through code change process, the fire service is helping to identify issues relating to spatial separation, limiting distances, fire service access, and the protection of combustible construction materials. The National Model Building Code in Canada and a number of our provincial codes have this weird thing called a 10-minute response time rule. This rule requires more stringent fire protection measures and larger spatial separation for construction that is outside a 10-minute response time by the fire service. And last month, the British Columbia Office of Housing and Construction Standard issued an opinion relating to how that 10-minute response rule is measured, and have indicated that the 10-minute response time is measured from when the fire department dispatcher communications receives a notification of a fire to the arrival of the first firefighting vehicle that is staffed and equipped to fight a fire for the purpose of limiting the exposure to adjacent buildings. Now, that's kind of convoluted, but that, in my view, is a very good thing, because the first firefighting vehicle that is staffed and equipped to fight a fire for the purposes of limiting the exposure to adjacent buildings, in my view, will likely be the fourth or fifth in vehicle, given that our priority is search and rescue and RIT operations. And so because of that ruling, it's most likely that a builder is going to have to provide more stringent fire protection measures. Mid-rise and high-rise combustible construction. This is a photo of a mid-rise combustible constructed building underway in Richmond, BC one day. And here it is later that night. Have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Michael Green? I know you were talking about him, Jay. Weren't you talking about Michael Green? He's an architect out of Vancouver, Canada, and in a recent TED YouTube video, he's proposing that he would like it to build a 30-story wood building. He claims that the use of concrete and steel consumes much more energy to manufacture than the energy used to harvest wood. and that concrete and steel contributes much more carbon to greenhouse gases than the use of lumber does. He also suggested that through sound engineering practices, he can mitigate the fire safety and seismic concerns. And he may be right, and I don't know how you feel, but I'm somewhat skeptical. The National Research Council, in conjunction with a number of stakeholders, are conducting tests to see how wood mid-rise combustible buildings fare in fires. But inherently, there just seems to be so many things that can go wrong with that practice. The proponents of wood construction are even talking about building an infill building, Walmart, 12 stories in building height. And to me, that just doesn't seem right. Ministry of Labour guidance notes. In the province of Ontario, the Ministry of Labour chairs a health and safety committee that's mandated under Section 21 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And it is incorporated to advise and make recommendations on matters relating to occupational health and safety of all firefighters in the province. This committee is comprised of an equal number of members from labor and management, including 4 members from the Ontario Professional Firefighters Association, 2 members from the Firefighters Association of Ontario, who represent the volunteer firefighters in Ontario, 4 from the Ontario Association of Fire Chiefs, and 2 from the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. The Section 21 committee actively looks at a number of these issues relating to firefighter safety, including issues that are associated with building codes such as photovoltaic systems, roof operations, lightweight construction, electrical hazards, salvage and overhaul, building collapse, dust collectors, and several other related matters. And speaking of PV systems are growing at a rate of 30% per year, and understandably, the fire service has a number of concerns about these systems. These concerns include firefighter vulnerability to electrical hazards when mitigating a fire involving PV systems. Traditional firefighter tactics for suppression, ventilation, and overhaul have been complicated by the proliferation of PV systems, thereby leaving firefighters vulnerable to potentially unrecognized exposures. PV systems present unique safety considerations. A very limited body of knowledge and insufficient data hinders the understanding of the risks to the extent that the fire service has been unable to develop safety solutions and respond in a safe manner. To that end, the Canadian Fire Service is working with CSA to develop a standard that takes into account some fire safety concerns that the fire service has expressed. Here is the link to the firefighter guidance note for PV systems. In essence, the guidance note suggests that the fire service should develop SOPs relating to firefighting or fighting fires involving PV systems. These OGs should identify PV system components and how they operate, identify electrical trip, slip, structural, inhalation, battery storage hazards, explain how the electrical systems in the building are shut down, show how to isolate the PV system from the rest of the building, identify access for ventilation, provide emergency contact information for an electrician, and include some suggested clear markings and labels so there's no confusion about electrical safety. Those of us involved in code development also need to look at requiring setbacks from the roof edge to allow firefighting access for venting and to provide pathways for access throughout the roof. We may even have to take the approach that they're taking in some countries in Europe that have adopted and directed their firefighters to no longer enter burning buildings with rooftop PV systems installed once it's known that nobody's in the building. Security devices that affect that egress. Obviously, there is a competing interest between keeping unauthorized people out of some buildings and providing easy access to exit for those people already in that building. And these days, it often seems that the building security is of a higher interest than the safety. The one trump card that we have in at least most of Canada is that fire safety and the ability to exit is mandated by code. Guarding a building from unauthorized entry is not, or at least not yet. At the National Research Council is struggling to balance these two competing interests, and the fire service remains diligent at the code development in hearings to ensure the fire safety message is heard, and sometimes we even have to play that trump card of saying that it's a code requirement. So these are some positive developments that have come out of some of the code development process that we're underway, not specifically related to code, but there's sort of a fallout. We talked earlier about first responder objective, how all the objectives are objective-based code, none of them deal with firefighter safety. Well, the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs has approached the NRC to ask them if they would consider amending the National Building and Fire Code so as to include an objective and functional statements that address firefighter safety to the degree that they can. I believe that some new tougher labor laws that hold employers more accountable for their employees' safety has caused NRC to soften their position about a fire safety objective, and NRC is taking the CAFC's request under advisement. Residential sprinklers. Some jurisdictions in Canada, including mine, did not require sprinklers in high-rise residential buildings until 2010, so 3 years ago. That has now changed, and it's clear that the various governments now understand what sprinklers can do in terms of occupant and firefighter safety. As it is here in the US, the fire service is leading the charge about residential sprinklers, and there is a considerable amount of dialogue about sprinklers at the code development hearings finally. I've noticed that the developers are a little less prone to just outright say no to sprinklers, and somewhat more prone to ask good questions about sprinklers, including how much can they mark it up, how do they work, who can install them, what are some of the perks or trade-offs that sprinklers can afford them. And I do think times they are changing. Oh, wait a minute, I gotta go back here. No, back, the other back. The other back. Oh, what's going on here? Okay, so cooktop safety. Cooking continues to be the #1 source of fires in Canadian homes, and I suspect that the same is here in the US. One manufacturer of a cooktop fire mitigation technology has submitted a code change proposal that would restrict the installation of a stove to just those appliances that use some form of fire mitigation. Now, I don't think it's the purpose of the building code to mandate what type of appliances can be put in the building, but I do believe that there is some justification for having the standard to which stoves are manufactured changed so that they do require a mitigation system so that food isn't heated to the point where it ignites. And to that end, the Ontario Fire Marshal and the Electrical Safety Authority, the Ontario Association of Fire Chiefs, and the Ontario Municipal Fire Prevention Officers Association have joined forces to see if they can make that happen. So change is inevitable. In Canada, as it is likely all over the world, our work environment is changing at a pace never seen before, and will continue to change exponentially due to technology, innovation, and financial pressures. And although I do embrace change, I suggest that it cannot be at the expense of firefighters' health and safety. And I suspect that most of you agree with me, otherwise you wouldn't be here. One of the ways that you can see that your interests are protected is to become actively involved in the code development process. And I know firsthand, as my other colleagues have said earlier, that when the fire service speaks, people listen. And a real good example of that was last week at the International Association of Fire Chiefs. They call it Fire Rescue International, their annual conference. At the Fire and Life Safety Section meeting, none other than Sean DeCrane was presented with an award from the International Code Council for his involvement in the code development process. So truly, and Sean, you can probably back me up, when the fire service speaks, we don't have to be technically sound, we just have to be honest and real, and the world does listen to us. You have the power to shape that change. Use it. The world is ruled by those that show up. Show up. And we'll do the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Just as a quick note as I pull up my presentation, there are buildings in Austria that are being proposed, all wood, to 41 stories. And they recently put a committee together to discuss the feasibility of tall wood buildings, and not one fire service representative was on that committee until the fire service membership group out of the ICC pushed it, and they named myself and Rick McCullough from Canada to that committee. So I'm going to try to wrap it up here for a question and answer session. I want to go through a couple of things. How many here are from fire prevention or have served in fire prevention? Okay. Truth is, I never have. Never spent a day in prevention. I've always been in suppression or in the union office. So how does a guy from suppression get involved in the codes? interesting, we should ask that question. As you can see, my name is Sean DeCrane. I'm currently the division's training chief for the Cleveland, Ohio, but I also represent the International Association to the International Code Council. And I also sit on NFPA 1, the Fire Code Technical Committee, a member of in fact, the chair of the International Fire Code Development Committee. And it was a long way to get here, but I was secretary for Local 93 for 8 years. And during that time, we spent a lot of time, the IAFF, as you know, this is the 22nd, I believe, Redmond Symposium. We take health and safety very seriously. And as the secretary, we're charged with negotiating the best wage we can for our members. We want our members to be compensated for the risk that they take in the field. So we do a lot of research, and this goes to Jason's point about accurate information, because NFPA commissioned a report. The initial report was published in 2002, and again, subsequently re-released in 2010. And again, to Jay's point, there's a lot of collaboration with NIST and the IAFF and UL, so you see a lot of the same terminologies and some of the same presentations involved in each. But when they issued this report in 2002 and a little bit later, it really kind of jumped out at me. And what NFPA did is they looked at fire fatalities from the 1970s to the 1990s, and they looked at the rate of fatalities. And they stayed pretty consistent, 5.8 to 5.8 firefighter deaths on the fire ground per 100,000 structure fires. But then they broke it down a little bit further. And they looked at the 1970s, and we lost 2.6 firefighters from cardiovascular events to every 100,000 structure fires. In the 1990s, that number dropped to 1.3. So maybe the health and wellness, the wellness fitness initiatives are having a positive impact. So if these numbers were staying the same, what numbers were changing? In the 1970s, we lost 1.8 firefighters per 100,000 structure fires from traumatic injury, falls, asphyxiation, burns, coming in contact with. In the 1990s, that number jumped to almost 3. When they reissued the report in 2010, it was 3 firefighters per 100,000 structure fires from traumatic injury. Now, what are the causes of this? Well, we could sit here all day and talk about it. We can talk about contents burn hotter, and the engineers in the room will start to go, fires don't burn hotter, fires burn at a consistent rate of temperature. But if you saw Dan Madrikowski and Steve Kerber's presentation, you know that the materials are fuel loads that we're putting in today's homes burn at a higher heat release rate. They're creating more energy. That more energy is creating more heat that our members are experiencing. The use of polyurethane foam furniture, which burns hotter. In fact, the polyurethane foam industry will tell us that we don't use polyurethane foam in the backs of the couches or the chairs anymore because the hurricane wiped out that industry. And when Dan Madrikowski did his studies down in South Carolina, he said it was true. But the new material burns even faster. So the use of turnout gear and enhancements are encapsulating our members so well, we're not recognizing the rapidly changing environment around us. Therefore, we're not recognizing when to get out. Again, we can look at that. There are presentations here this week on that. But is it a factor? Quite possibly, yes. The insulation factor in today's buildings. We're encapsulating these buildings so we don't let air in. Well, we don't let air out, and allows the buildup of heat at a greater rate. But the building codes are allowing less mass and more protection trade-offs. In the 2003 International Building Code, there were roughly 270 sprinkler trade-offs. In the 2012 edition of the International Building Code, there are 500 trade-offs, meaning that if you install sprinklers, then you can reduce the passive fire protection within that building. Now, we are very strong sprinkler advocates, but we can't put all our protection features in one basket. Just August 14th, it's my birthday, that's why I remember the date so well, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the Great Blackout, where we lost power from west of Cleveland all the way up through to Toronto. We had no municipal water in the city of Cleveland for 2 days. We had tankers sitting on our apparatus. We have trillions of gallons in the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, right off our shores. So, but if we didn't have water, neither did anyone else. So how does this suppression guy get to becoming active in fire prevention? Well, I went to a code hearing on a DARE. It was in Cincinnati. I'm in Cleveland. It's just like plumbing. Cleveland's up here, Cincinnati's down here. So it was a challenge to go. But when I got there, I saw people speaking for the fire service, about the fire service, what we wanted, what we needed, what our desires and tactics were, and it was very, very apparent to me that none of these people had been in a building that in a working fire, had never crawled down a dark hallway, hoping to find the seat of the fire so you can get your butt back out. So someone had to speak, and there was a code change proposal that would label fire-rated walls, and I said, you know what, we just laid off 70 firefighters in Cleveland, closed 4 companies, we're relying more on company inspections. This would be a great tool for our company officers to recognize that that's a fire-rated wall. If there's an opening in it, I better refer it over to the Fire Prevention Bureau. An architect got up and said, firefighters checking my drop ceilings? I'd get more value out of them if they emptied my waste baskets. I couldn't believe my ears. So went up, corrected him at the microphone, and then left and said, by the way, we don't do waste baskets. That architect has actually become a friend. But then it came to the tipping point, and this is where I met Brian Maltby. I went to a code technology committee meeting in Chicago, and there were 3 of us from the fire service in this room that had about 100 people in it. And they kept talking about, they didn't come out and say it. Finally, someone stood up and said, we're talking about acceptable losses. What are we comfortable with in acceptable losses of building occupants? And the conversation went on, and finally I raised my hand, and they were like, yes. And I said, what about us? We're going in for those acceptable losses. They said, don't worry, we care about you. It's in the intent of the code. So I wasn't so sure of it, so I wrote a 6-page letter to Rich Duffy outlining why we needed to be involved, and he said, congratulations, you just volunteered. So that's how I got here. But we have to think of ways, and first of all, we have to start using the terminology. When we start talking about we want to improve the work environment for our members, I may ask Jay here, and Jay will go, hey, put a diesel exhaust system on the apparatus floor. Great idea. Jason might say, you know, separate the turnout gear from the living quarters, so a separate area so we don't troop in those carcinogens into our living quarters. Great idea. Brian wants the 55-inch TV in the day room so he can watch his training videos. All great ideas, but those of our staging area, that's the station house. That's not the environment our members are operating in. If we think about it in military terminology, what's your staging area? Where you go, you gather your troops, gather your supplies, prepare to deploy. Once you deploy, that's your operational area. That's your work environment. And our work environment are the buildings that we respond to and operate in, usually when that building is under stress. So how is that building designed? To what? We talk about being involved in the codes. Well, the buildings are designed and built to the International Building Code, which is widely adopted here in the US, NFPA 5000, which is NFPA's version of the building code, or mostly used over in the Middle East. And then it's also maintained, though, by the Life Safety Code, NFPA 101, usually in healthcare facilities, the International Fire Code, or NFPA's Fire Code, NFPA 1. These are the buildings that outline the maintenance of those structures. And some people say, well, why should a firefighter be involved in the building code? Well, we're the ones, as soon as that certificate of occupancy is handed over, whose responsibility is that building's? It's ours. So therefore, we're the ones that are going to use the protection systems within that building. We should be involved in how that building is designed and built. And so real quickly, we talked about the different codes out there. This is the International Code Council. There are 15 codes within the International Code Council. They even have a pool and spa code, anything for revenue. It's on a 3-year cycle. They've broken it down to 3 separate cycles to split up the codes. The International Building Code is in one cycle, the Fire Code and Residential Code is in another, and then the Green and Energy Code is in a third one. And right now we're in the middle of the Fire Code and Residential Code cycle, and the final action hearing will be in Atlantic City the first week of October. And the interesting thing about the ICC is at the final action hearing, only governmental members can vote. Industry doesn't have a vote. Industry sits on the committee. In the initial round, it goes through committee, but then the final action vote comes to fire and building officials. And that's why we need to be involved at the final action hearing. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. But there's also NFPA. National Fire Protection Association publishes over 300 codes and standards. And as Jay was talking about, they can affect everything from our apparatus, our turnout gear, to how the building is built, how the building is maintained. And it's very important that we become active. Find a passion and become involved. And you start to find out the value and the reward of being involved. NFPA is also on a 3-year process. The biggest difference between NFPA and ICC right now is NFPA is mostly committee-based. The work is committee-based. The committee can modify proposals. They can say, Ralph, that was a great idea, but I don't like the terminology Ralph used, so I'm going to word it a little bit differently and then adopt it in. Now, the public can still comment on it, and the final vote does come down to the NFPA annual meeting, but then that vote can also, then it's referred to the Standards Council. People ask, are building codes really important to the fire service? Well, how many believe ventilation is important? Especially listen to Dan and Steve. What about the height and area limits of a building? Are those important? And to Jay's point, I sat on the committee on height and area, and we actually came up with one great decision out of theirs, that the height and area limits in today's buildings were not based on science. They were based on someone's personal opinion back in the 1920s. Egress, is that important? Absolutely. All this is established within the codes. So this will just give in Cleveland we have financial trouble, so we were looking at this as a revenue generating moment.
20 pounds! 20 pounds on my left! 30 pounds! 20 on my right! 50 pounds! 50! 70! 90! 200 pounds! 200 pounds up there! Anyone else? Going, gone!
Okay, it's a little fun there, but what that shows, though, it shows that anytime we have a resident that can't get out of a building, it shows a systemic failure. A failure, because we design these buildings to get the occupants out. And if we have a resident in this situation, there's a flaw. And that flaw can be addressed through the codes. I want to touch on the residential aspect because I really want to touch on some of the things the IAFF has been very successful in, and it's important to the safety of our members. We're dealing with a higher fuel load in the residential atmosphere. This picture was taken actually out of a 1997 National Geographic, and it demonstrates the plastics that are in a typical American home. Now, someone may look at that and go, oh, look at the toys. I'm not sure if that's a bathtub he's in or where that pool is, but, it was in the house. But we look at it as a fuel load. These thermoplastics, they burn like gasoline. The heat release rate is high. We're seeing times to flash over a much earlier rate. But we're also seeing the building construction practices under stress in a much greater period of time or a much shorter period of time and under greater duress. What got the IAFF really involved in the codes? And it was at our biannual convention, August 13th, 2006. Brother Arnie Wolf in Green Bay was killed, and Sister Joe Brinkley was severely injured in a collapse. The house was built in the late 1990s, and the property is still vacant at this point. The guy who built the house was a home builder. So first of all, any home builders in the audience? Okay, good. He was not insured, was not self-bonded. He has not rebuilt on the property, and to this day, he is publicly testifying against residential sprinklers. The tragedy is the crews did just about everything right. Brother Wolf, Sister Brinkley arrived. They were on a squad. The report was the initial engine company arrived on the scene, reported smoke showing, working fire in the basement. A neighbor was standing on the tree lawn, told the incoming officer, the neighbor's home. I just spoke to him 3 or 4 minutes ago. I know he's home. So the officer ran up to the front door, beat on the door. The dog was barking on the other side of the door, which tells us it's a tenable atmosphere. So they made the decision. They took the handline in the front door, tried to find the steps. Brother Wolf, Sister Brinkley went in, went to the left. Smoke conditions started to bank down. They got on their hands and knees, started crawling. And I'll be able to play the video. You'll hear Joe Brinkley talk about it. But she had his boot, and then all of a sudden there was a loud crack. Arnie Wolf went into the room of origin, and they had communications with him for 6 minutes before he perished. Joe Brinkley fell on the opposite side of a wall, was protected by the debris. She was able to self-extricate, and the RIT team found her in the back of the room. But again, this house it's a single-family home. It had a hybrid mixture of engineered I-joist and metal plate-connected wood truss. When the company got to the basement, they reported they slipped and fell a couple of times. They actually made the basement, but when they turned to hit the fire, they kept slipping and falling. This house also had the insulated structural panels. Did that insulation contribute to the rapid fire growth? We're not positive, but it's a consideration. So in the NIOSH report, it came out, and one of the recommendations was to modify the current codes to require that lightweight trusses are protected on the top and bottom. What a novel idea to take a recommendation from NIOSH and act upon it and protect our members. So we looked at how we do that. And the intent of the residential code talks about the purpose of this code, blah, blah, blah. And that last sentence, and to provide safety to firefighters and emergency responders during emergency conditions. This is exactly what Brian and those and our brothers and sisters in Canada are trying to get into their code. This wasn't always in there. And in 2006, the ICC administration was trying to duplicate all their code intents. So it was in the fire code, it was in the building code, they wanted to put it in the residential code. Well, who opposed it? The home builders. We were able, under public action, to go in and get it stated in the intent because it's very important. Because this is the language in the code prior to 2012. It says floor construction shall be capable of accommodating all loads and transmitting the resulting loads to the supporting structural elements. Does it say anything about fire performance? None. How do I-joists get approved for installation in residential properties or truss? Because they can distribute the load. That's all they were required to perform to. So we wanted to change it. We attempted to change it, but the committee told us we had insufficient technical justification. We had a number of firefighters there, but we didn't have technical justification. Now this is where the research comes into play, because right at this time is when UL released that initial report on the performance of lightweight construction and was for firefighter safety and showed the collapse of post-flashover of 6 minutes. The National Research Center of Canada was looking at things from an occupant safety. And in their test, they identified at least one area where that floor was collapsing when they had a tenable atmosphere on the first floor. And also Tyco was doing a series of tests for the residential construction, protection of lightweight construction in residence. And they all came out with similar early collapse times. So that kind of forced the issue. We reapplied it, used this technical justification, and the home builders actually came to us and asked us for a resolve, asked us for a compromise. Now, this is now in the International Residential Code as of January 2012. It was a compromise. Did we get everything we wanted? Absolutely not. Did we give up some exceptions? Yes, we did. For residential sprinklers, also for dimensional lumber. But we didn't have the empirical data on the dimensional lumber. Due to the tests with NIST and UL, now we are gathering that empirical data, and we're taking it back to the code process. And I predict we'll see all codes, or I should say all floors, protected at some point. And we realized that there were so many code issues, and I'm going to jump off here for a minute because I want to show you this video, that this was a value to our members, and that it was very important that the IAFF get involved. So under the leadership of Pat Morrison, we created this catch video to get the information out there, get the message out. And we also created 9 educational modules that are going on a web page that as soon as Jim Brinkley and I can sit down, it should be posted. It'll be on building construction and building codes. And we intend to put more educational modules up there, but you'll see, this is the
Brothers and sisters,
video.
the IAFF has an important new program intended to improve your safety on the job. Building codes have a direct impact on you, but too often firefighters and fire departments don't participate in the development of those codes. Too often, we don't understand why it's important to be part of this process. So we have prepared an important video to increase awareness and encourage your involvement in creating new building codes and promoting enforcement. Nothing is more important than your safety, so please make use of the information to follow. God bless and stay safe.
New housing under construction. While it may meet local building codes, how will it react in a fire? For firefighters, an occupancy under changing conditions of combustion is our work environment. How does your local code perform under these conditions? And how much did you have to do with the code process?
A firefighter's office, when he's working, is in a building that's on fire. So knowing its structural integrity, knowing how it was developed and how it was built and how it'll react under fire conditions is truly important for firefighter survival. Years past, when firefighters were dispatched, they would have maybe a 3 or 4, maybe even a 5-minute response time. Once they arrived on the scene, they probably had 4 or 5 minutes to get inside, make a rescue, or put the fire out. In today's environment with lightweight construction, they arrive on the scene as they're making entry into the building's coming down around them.
Each year, approximately 100 firefighters die in the line of duty. The majority of firefighters lose their life in residential fires. Here in Green Bay, August 13, 2006, Brother Arnie Wolf lost his life in a house that was built with lightweight construction.
Yeah, we walked in the front door, we stood in the foyer, and Arnie said, let's go to the left. And he went about 2 steps and went down on his knees. I followed behind him, grabbed his boot so I could follow him through the smoke. And the next step I took, he was gone. I felt his boot just pull away from me, and then I felt myself falling. The floor had collapsed under us. I started yelling for Arnie. I couldn't hear him, I couldn't see him, and I couldn't move. There was just solid walls of fire all the way around me.
The code allowed this. The code allowed this type of construction. It did not require any form of fire protection in that home.
After the Edgewood incident, I think the biggest thing that has changed for us is the increased awareness. It's the knowledge in our firefighters that these new construction methods aren't as resilient, and it's going to take awareness on their end, but it's also going to take action to get the codes changed.
It's unfortunate. A lot of our codes come about as a result of tragedy. So what we have to do is keep the public, keep firefighters and the citizens aware of these types of danger.
If we're not tuned into current code processes, current code changes, the way buildings are being built today, we're going to find ourselves in environments we don't understand.
Basically, the code tells you how to design a building, almost like your cookbook of how to build a building.
And these codes are the basis of building and fire regulations in all 50 states. The home builders, the building owners, the architects, the engineers, and many other stakeholders are very engaged in the process, and as is the fire service. But firefighters from the suppression side have not been as involved.
If we got involved with how these buildings are designed, built, and maintained, we start to improve the work environment for our members.
Underwriters Laboratory undertook a firefighter safety research project that addressed the performance issues with lightweight construction and dimensional lumber. The cameras that we had set up really showed the performance of what may be encountered during a real-life fire event. So one of the significant findings of that project was an engineered I-joist floor system collapsed at 6 minutes. Traditionally, the fire services used rules of thumb, whether it be sponginess of a floor or what they would call the 20-minute collapse rule. The lightweight systems that we're seeing and the full-scale testing that we're seeing are showing that those rules of thumb don't apply anymore.
So you're going to build a house today is just going to have less mass than a house that was built even 5 years ago. And if it has less mass, it has less inherent fire resistance. At the same time, we're putting more fuel into these houses. All our furniture, all our belongings is basically petroleum-based. So we're bringing more petroleum into this house that has inherently less fire resistance.
Today's modern fire load in a residential building is all synthetics. We're finding that fires are reacting very differently than they did even 10 years ago. And because of that, we're getting this fire dynamics in these buildings that is catching the fire service off guard.
Firefighters need to help develop codes. And the reason they need to help develop codes is because we go into the structures that are built by the codes.
Certainly the safety of a building occupant is considered in the code development process, but it tends to stop short of firefighter safety.
When I was a firefighter and involved in actually hands-on firefighting, I didn't think anything about the codes actually, and never thought about getting involved in them. And then we would come back from a fire and say, wow, we had a real problem with this because of the construction type or because of the egress issues. Never really thinking that, well, maybe that wouldn't have been the case if we would have had input into the code development process.
There are two processes: the International Code Council, which establishes the International Building Code, the Residential Code, and the International Fire Code. There are actually 15 codes in the ICC family. And there's the National Fire Protection Association, which publishes NFPA 1, which is the Fire Code, NFPA 101, better known as the Life Safety Code, and the National Electrical Code. There are approximately 300 other fire and life safety codes published by NFPA.
The codes are on 3-year cycles, so every 3 years we publish a new edition. And it's important that all stakeholders be at the table, and the fire service is a big component.
We get a coalition of people to come and talk to this advisory council to let them know the other side, and not just listening to the builder's side or the builders association side, but not just the money side, but also the safety side of it for the occupant as well as firefighters.
Firefighters don't get involved in the code development process. They're not participating as stakeholders in their own health and safety.
Getting provisions in the code is one thing. The challenge comes at the state and local level.
Firefighters need to understand when someone says it's up to code, we need to ask what code. Because just because it's up to the local code doesn't mean it's up to the national building code, the model code.
As a local president, as a union leader, and as a firefighter, whether you're a lieutenant riding a truck or you're that brand new rookie, you should be involved in the code and in the political process so that you know and that you have a say-so in how things are being built in your cities.
When you're crawling down that hall and smoke and fire's rolling over your head, that's a totally different perspective than sitting at a table designing a building.
You are the end user of this legislation. If it gets passed, it will have the potential to save your life or save you from a career-ending injury, and you'll be around for your family.
So I'll play it after the session. But just one thing I wanted to build on, and I'll ask my colleagues to come to the dais for the questions. It's not just about one item. And in Minneapolis, we had 1,500 firefighters there for the residential sprinkler vote. And as soon as residential sprinkler was passed, 800 people stood up and left the room. The very next code change proposal was the protection of lightweight construction. And you needed a 2/3 majority to overturn the committee. And we had a majority. 750 less votes. We lost the supermajority by 52 votes. So if 52 members would have stayed in that room, we would have had the protection of lightweight construction 3 years earlier in the code. So it's important that we get involved and we stay involved, because it's not just about one issue. It's about a number of issues, and the studies that NIST did after 9/11, like I said, I have a 2-hour presentation. I cut down to 20 minutes. But these are just a couple of items. The emergency radio operability that Jay referred to, 9/11 just brought it to the forefront. But every single one of us in this room can have a story of when their radios did not work. We go to the line of duty vets presentation every 2 years at Redmond. Radio operability is always an issue. But after 9/11, after that report came from NIST, we got a coalition of industry, actually from BOMA, from the AIA, the architects, got together and put language together and put it in the building code that every building that goes up, our radios have to work in 97% of that building. And more importantly, it's in the fire code. So 18 months after adoption, every building in your jurisdiction is required to have radio operability that your radios work in that building. Your radios. Jay did it in Boston. IAFF, we were able to do it at the national level by pushing, by having firefighters there, staking their point, saying this is a life safety issue, not just for us, but for the citizens we're going in to search for. And that's what being involved in the codes is. And it's important to get it at the national level, but unless we are active at the state and local level, it could all go for naught, because people will take these codes and adopt things out that they don't want in there, or that they say make it cost prohibitive. But if we are active, we can make sure it stays in at the local level. I appreciate your attention and time.